what's today's workshop about? So today's workshop is about taking charge of your life. That's the title of the workshop. Take charge of your life, making effective choices to reach your goals. It's a series, this is the first of a series of 2 interactive workshops that are aimed at helping participants reduce stress, attain greater happiness, see things more clearly, and make effective decisions in their lives. So it's going to be about strategies to achieve these goals. Now the first event, as I mentioned, making effective choices to reach your goals. The second event will be on April 8th, so a week from now, same room, 5:30 p.m. It will focus on reducing stress and attaining greater happiness, so strategies for doing that. Now, today's event, I should mention, is co-sponsored by the OSU New York History Department, the Cultural Arts and Events Grants Committee, and the Behavioral Decision-Making Initiative at Ohio State. So, let me introduce one of the 2 speakers. That's Agnes Vishnevkin, right there. She has an MBA. She has over 10 years of experience in the nonprofit sector, including operations, strategic planning, and philanthropy. She has a background in helping individuals and organizations develop and apply customized strategies to achieve their goals, whatever they may happen to be. She has a passion for helping others adopt evidence-based strategies for effective thinking and acting.
Thank you very much. Our first workshop will be presented by Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, who is Assistant Professor of History over here at OSU New York. He's also a member of the Behavioral Decision-Making Initiative at The Ohio State University. Dr. Tsipursky has a scholarly background in analyzing how individuals and organizations accomplish their goals within the confines of broader social structures. He has expertise and experience in drawing upon academic research from cognitive science, educational psychology, behavioral economics, and other fields in order to teach and coach others to adopt evidence-based practices for evaluation, decision-making, and goal achievement. And so the topic of his talk will be intentional clarity, which will talk about tools to accurately assess your environment in order to make the best choices. So here's Dr. Tsipursky.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I appreciate that. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the first part of the talk, seeing things clearly. It's about seeing things clearly, assessing your environment clearly, basically. So, have you heard the phrase, go with your gut? More people here. Welcome, welcome. So, you're here for the good part, going with your gut. Basically, it refers to evaluating situations intuitively, immediately, quickly, using your emotions. So that's what the phrase refers to. Our gut allows us to make our way through the world automatically on autopilot, making quick decisions. Now, indeed, we can hardly make it for the day otherwise if we had to think through every decision that we made, and if we didn't go with our gut, if we didn't just do the automatic things that we typically do. Yet, is going with our gut always the right decision? Now, sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. Actually, based on research, going with our gut, based on cognitive science research, going with our gut is a pretty good way of deciding things. It's right about 80% of the time. So 80% of the time, going with our gut is going to turn out to be right. But that means that 20% of the time, it's going to be wrong. And I think we can do better than that. I think 1 out of 5 times being wrong, that's a problematic statistic for me. That's a problematic number. So this research on gut feelings really connects with me on a personal level. So here's the story I want to share about me, about my life, what happened. So several years ago, I met this guy at a party. And we really didn't click, kind of. We just didn't connect. It was hard for me to really feel close to him. So I wasn't that eager in getting to know him better. But some of my friends said he's great and that I should give him a chance. And I took a workshop much like this one a while ago, and I knew that I shouldn't necessarily trust my gut feelings. So I decided to trust the opinions of my friends and give him a chance, kind of spend some time with him, hang out with him. And you know what? It turned out that he's actually really great, that he actually was really hard to get to know, and he is intimidated by new people, new situations, new environments, so he makes bad first impressions. But he's a great friend now. And if I went with my gut that time, I would have lost the opportunity for a really valuable friendship. And that's something that a friendship that I treasure and that I would not have wanted to not have. Now, am I the only one in the room whose gut occasionally makes mistakes? Raise your hand if your gut ever made a mistake. Okay, that's pretty much almost everyone. Okay, so now that we're thinking about the kinds of things that our gut is mistaken on, take a minute or two to write down or think through some specific situations, a couple of specific situations where your gut made a mistake. Think them through and think through specific situations because you'll be working, or write down specific situations because you'll be working with them in the later part of the workshop. So, I'll give you 2 minutes. And think through the details of that situation. What you thought, what you experienced, what your emotions were, why you made those decisions. All right, so let's think about why we made those mistakes. Do you know why you made the mistakes that you just thought of? Why did you not assess the situation correctly in the spot? Do you recognize that right now? Well, we'll talk about some ways that our thinking goes wrong in these specific gut instinct situations. And we'll start by talking about a broad framework for how we think and feel. Then we'll talk about some specific ways that our thinking goes wrong as examples of specific ways that our thinking goes wrong. And we'll finish off with talking about strategies to deal with these problems. Now, fortunately, research in cognitive science and behavioral economics shows that there are effective ways of dealing with these challenges. And that's actually very good news. It means that we can figure out specific ways of accommodating for these mistaken ways of thinking and developing better ways of thinking that will serve our future goals more effectively. So, let's talk about systems. System 1 and System 2. So our minds seem cohesive to us. That's what our perception is. We perceive our minds as cohesive, but research in cognitive science actually shows that our minds are not cohesive by any measure. A more accurate way of describing our minds, one that's actually based on what the research has found about the mind, is a jumble of components, a jumble of different modules, with these modules serving different purposes. And one of these modules serves to give us this sense of cohesion, of unity, of cognitive unity, which actually is not the case. It does not correspond to actual reality. So generally, these modules fall within 2 systems. And Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winner, called them System 1 and System 2. So System 1 and System 2. Now, understanding the differences between these is really important. It gives the most research-based understanding of how we think and feel, and therefore allows us to figure out how to think and feel better. So, System 1 is an autopilot system. It's fast, it's intuitive, it's really emotional. It takes little or no effort to do it, of any sort. There's no sense of intentional control. It's just something we do. We feel it is the right way, and we do it, and there's no sense of control or effort. It involves automatic thinking and feeling patterns. So that's what it does. Subconscious beliefs and assumptions are within System 1. All sorts of habits, cognitive habits, physical habits, everything. That's within System 1. So that's the emotional, intuitive autopilot system. Now, System 2 is the intentional system. It's slower, it's deliberative, it's logical, it chooses to pay attention. So when you choose to pay attention to something, you do System 2 thinking. When you are being your most conscious and reasoning self, that's System 2 thinking. Now, it takes a lot of effort. So you can think of system 2 as pretty lazy. Now it takes cognitive effort and it takes energy. So it takes calories, energy, it takes a lot of effort. And when we think of ourselves, we think of ourselves as a conscious reasoning self, as a system 2. Now, again, that's not what actually is going on in our minds. Now, so we think of ourselves, we can imagine ourselves thinking of ourselves as just this human being, the person who is. That's the impression that we have. Now, the reality is that we're more like a rider, human being, on an elephant. And the elephant is our system 1, and the rider is our system 2. So imagine this huge elephant and rider. Ah, thank you. Oh, thank you for the reminder. You're awesome. That would have been helpful. Anyway. So, the elephant and the elephant rider. So, we are actually, system 2 is the rider of the elephant, and system 1 is the elephant. And if you can envision an elephant, that's kind of bulky creature, uncontrolled, huge. Our system 1 is huge by comparison to our system 2. So when I was talking about 80%, right decisions, wrong decisions, our system 1 is something like 90% of our thinking goes through system 1 thinking, and 10% goes through system 2. So the elephant rider image is actually a good impression of what is going on, because the elephant is this really uncontrolled large beast, powerful beast, that does whatever it wants in many cases, and you're like the rider trying to manage the elephant. When you try to restrain yourself from, I don't know, having food, or saying things that are not going to serve you best. Those are things, that's when your system 2 is trying to restrain your system 1. Now, the system 1, as I mentioned, uses little energy and it runs automatically all the time. It creates impressions, feelings, intuitions. That's what system 1 does. Now, system 2, by comparison, runs in low effort mode most of the time, and it uses a lot of energy. When is system 2 engaged? When system 1 runs into difficulty, so when system 1 is in new situations that it has trouble processing, so that's when system 2 is engaged. When we're learning new information, so when we're gaining new information, we're forming new connections, it's system 2 that is working. When the system 2 detects an awareness of potential for error, when there's a potential for some kind of failure, that's when system 2 is turned on. And when we're being intentionally reasoning and logical, that's when system 2 is active. So all of those times are when system 2 is deliberately turned on. Now, as I mentioned, system 1 usually makes good decisions, 80% of the time, pretty good rate. However, it's prone to some predictable errors. And these are predictable errors. And around two kinds of issues. Really emotional issues that have to do with emotions, habitual thinking, habitual patterns, and issues around assessing probabilities. So those are times when the system 1 is likely to be mistaken. Now, these are called cognitive biases in research by scholars such as Dan Ariely, Amos Tversky, and so on. Now, the interesting thing is that our system 2 does not get engaged when we make these errors if it is not aware of us making these errors. It just goes on. So system 2 is not engaged, and we keep making the same predictable errors. Now, the intentional system can prevent system 1 errors, and that's great. So system 2 can prevent system 1 errors, but it needs to be activated first. It needs to be engaged. It needs to be turned on. And that requires an intentional focus, an intentional effort. So, this is actually great. They're predictable errors, they're systematic errors, we know what kind of errors are made. we can use this knowledge to our benefit. Knowledge is power here. It's real power. Now, there's a broad strategy of figuring out how to turn on System 2 when we need it most. In situations when we're likely to make mistakes. So you can think of it as training the elephant rider self part of you. So again, you're all of you, you're always both the elephant and the elephant rider. And here is how to train the elephant rider. You can learn to recognize situations when you're likely to be mistaken. So that's a broad framework of strategy. You can learn about specific mental errors and watch out for them. So those specific mental errors, and that's a second broad strategy. We'll talk about more strategies later. And you can learn how to turn on System 2 intentionally and effectively. So you can train your ability to turn on your System 2. Now, you can also make changes to System 1. You can train the elephant, not only the elephant rider. You can train the elephant. Our brains are incredibly flexible, apparently, according to cognitive science research. And that means that we can use System 2, our rational, conscious, cognitive self, to make changes in the way that System 1 works. We can reshape automatic thoughts and habits to match our goals. So that's one element of training the elephant. So reshaping our automatic habits and patterns to match our long-term goals. We can internalize a habit of watching out for problematic situations. So we can internalize that habit, develop new, better habits of watching out for these things. And we can make more intentional and mindful ways of thinking more habitual and automatic. So we can make that way of thinking more automatic. Now, how do we do that? There are a number of strategies. One of them is to develop positive emotions for ways of thinking and feeling that actually meet your long-term goals. So positive emotions. Remember, System 1 works with emotional language. So it works with emotions, and we can associate specific positive emotions with specific ways we want to behave. We can choose a course of action when we're our reasoning, logical self and commit to it. For example, we can choose a course of action of not eating a cookie. And then during the time when we are in a situation where there are cookies, we can remember, oh, earlier I committed to not eating a cookie. So we can fix specific problematic habits through choosing courses of action that match our goals. Now, we can intentionally choose to put ourselves in situations that will reshape our System 1 environment. So reshape the System 1. And that means deliberately getting yourself in situations that you know are good for you. So intentionally thinking about what situation you would prefer, what situation you actually want to be in, and then choosing to shape yourself, choosing to put yourself in that situation. And then there are various strategies relating to meditation, visualizations, cognitive behavioral therapy, which you can specifically use to reshape certain aspects of your System 1. Okay. Are there any questions at this point? So brief questions, we'll have a longer discussion then.
Part of reshaping System 1 is just choosing your environment. Say you don't want to exercise, but you at least force yourself to go to the gym building, and you're going to probably be more likely to exercise because it's an environment of that.
Absolutely. That is a great example. So if you want to go exercise after coming home from studying, coming to your dorm room from studying, one good strategy is to put on your gym clothes right away. And then that would remind you later, oh, okay, I meant to go and exercise, and then to go to the gym, intending to exercise. So not focus on the final thing, on exercising, focus on the immediate steps leading there. So you're reshaping your environment in that way as well. There are many strategies like that. Okay. So let's think about I'm going to give you two examples of predictable thinking errors. So the first one relates to the question of why did they do it, why did you do it? Now, why did they do it? That's a common phrase you hear. Why did they do it? Why did they do it? It's a common phrase. It refers to questioning somebody's motivation. Usually it refers to them doing something bad. So that's kind of the intended idea. Oh, why did they do that? Like it's something bad. Now, another way of thinking about it is, why did you do it? Now, does that mean that you did something for the bad reason? We usually don't think of ourselves as doing something for bad reasons, for problematic reasons. We usually don't question our own motives. But how do other people think about our motives if we think of their motives as negative when using the phrase, why did they do it? Well, research, cognitive science research, suggests that our intuition, our system one, our emotions, our gut reactions, tend to interpret the actions of others and their motives in pretty harsh terms, kind of in negative terms. We see them, we see their actions, we interpret it excessively negatively. It also makes an immediate judgment of people's overall personality based on this very limited information, usually negative information. So it makes this really immediate judgment, emotional, intuitive judgment. Now this is what the phrase, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see well enough to take the speck out of your brother's eye, warns us about, if you've heard the phrase. So this is what the phrase warns us about. Now, how does this play out in real life? Well, imagine that you're driving, and I know I do, and most of us drive on autopilot, and suddenly the car in front of you, cuts you off pretty badly, and you're really shocked and scared and indignant, and maybe you flash your lights or you honk your horn. And what's your immediate intuitive gut reaction about the driver of the other car? You think the guy is like, yeah, he's right. Whatever way you want to, you don't think good thoughts about that person. Right. Okay. So that's one scenario. Now imagine you're driving and you're again driving an autopilot, and then you suddenly realize you need to make a right turn, and you quickly go over into the lane next to you, and you suddenly hear honking behind you, and you realize that in your rush you forgot to check your blind spot, and you cut off the guy behind you pretty badly. Do you think of yourself as a jerk? Do you think of yourself as rude and obnoxious? No, that's not the case. You don't think of yourself that way. So that's another scenario. Why did you do it? Now here's another scenario. Let's say, you're in a situation and your friend got hurt, and you're driving your friend to the hospital, and you're driving really aggressively. You're cutting people off, you're doing really what would otherwise be rude stuff. But your gut reaction to yourself is not to think of yourself as rude and obnoxious. It's to say that, okay, that's behavior that's justified in that situation. So that's another situation. So again, why did you do it? Now, how's that helpful? Well, it relates to the way we think about ourselves and other people. It turns out that this pattern of thinking, why did they do it and why did you do it, is not a coincidence. So there's research by Lee Ross, Dan Gilbert, and others for this type of error in thinking and feeling, where we essentially give ourselves a pass on behavior that we would label obnoxious and rude in others, that our gut reaction would label as obnoxious and rude in others. And it's called fundamental attribution error. So, and it basically states that we tend to interpret the actions of others more harshly than our own, and we tend to judge the personality of others based on very limited information. If we see someone behaving in a way that we perceive as rude and obnoxious, we think of that person as rude and obnoxious. We don't automatically stop and think about whether that behavior resulted from a situation that the person finds themselves in, or whether it's a result of that person's personality. Now, and again, we don't attribute the same behavior to ourselves. We attribute it to others. With the driver example, maybe the other person didn't see you as, if they were driving autopilot, or maybe they need to drive their injured friend to the hospital. But that's not what our automatic system one reaction tells us. Now, what's the actual probability? So when you think about probabilities, what the actual likelihood is, what is it really? Now look around you. The people in this room are good people. Most people in the world are good people. And they are not inherently rude and obnoxious and jerks. Now, very few people intentionally choose to hurt others. So, I'm sure none of you intentionally would choose to hurt others. So, what happens there? Why do we think of ourselves as jerks, of others as rude and obnoxious? So we don't think of ourselves as jerks.
Confusion of responsibility. Like it prevents you from feeling responsibility. So instead of you feeling responsibility for cutting someone off, it helps you ease your conscience by blaming it on someone else.
Right, or not blaming it, or just refusing to blame, because it's not, you just know that you do it because you need to cut off that person because you're driving your friend to the hospital, or it wasn't your fault, you didn't see that person. Yes?
When's your first reaction because you think they're a jerk, but when they cut you off, because your first reaction is going to be self-preservation, and they could have just killed you, so you're like, what are you doing? Like, you could have just killed me.
Right.
So it's like self-preservation, and then not thinking, like, your first reaction isn't to justify why they were doing that. It's, you almost ended my life.
Right, so, and the interesting thing is our gut reaction is not to the situation. We're not afraid of the situation. We're afraid of the person. We personalize it in a way that doesn't actually correspond to reality, because the reality is that the situation threatens us. It's the person didn't see us, or the person is driving their friend to the hospital that threatens us. It's not the person. The person would otherwise be a great, person to get to know and whatnot. You probably want to be the person's friend if they're driving their friend to the hospital. That's the kind of friend you hope you would have, right? So we don't notice that we are doing something to offend others or upset others because we are going in autopilot, not being mindful, And that's, again, that situational driving is one example, Other examples are sending off emails and texts without thinking through the consequences of our actions, or saying something that's hurtful. Nothing that ever happened to me. Nothing that ever happened to me, sure. So what's the usefulness of learning about the fundamental attribution error? Well, when I learned about it, it helped me be more humble with other people. So it taught me that I should be less judgmental about others, basically, that people around me aren't nearly as bad as my gut feelings would indicate. So that's kind of the practical element of it. And this decreased my stress levels, and I gained more peace and calm and a more realistic view of other people. So that's kind of one benefit of learning about this fundamental attribution error. And like I said, I also became more humble. I realized my intuitive self-evaluation of my actions is going to be excessively positive, and the way other people evaluate me, the way they perceive me, is going to be more negative than I think they do. So it made me more thoughtful about how I appear to others. So the perception that I make on others became more important to me, became more emotionally salient and relevant to me, and I became more thoughtful about that. Let's talk about another one, attentional bias. Now, should we always pay attention? Always pay attention is a phrase that you probably heard often in your life. I know I did. My mother would tell me, always pay attention when I was growing up. Adults in my life would tell me that. The phrase always pay attention is really widespread in our culture. If you Google it, you'll get something like 8 million hits. Indeed, the ability to pay attention is vital in life, but research by Kyle Smith, Tanya Chartrand, and others indicates that always paying attention may be counterproductive in some cases. It may be really counterproductive, in part due to the concept of research bias. Attentional bias. So we tend to pay attention to factors that appeal most to our attentions, especially negative ones. Before we have a chance to bring our conscious system to awareness to any situation, or even if we never do bring our system to awareness to any situation, our system 1 already reacts. It's a much faster way of reacting. It reacts and reacts in an emotional, intuitive way, and especially to the negative elements in the situation. And that relates back to the point that was raised earlier about the need to survive, kind of the defense mechanism. So it really reacts very quickly. Now, here's an example where this might be problematic. Most of us are not afraid of driving. I'm not sure if anybody in this room is afraid of driving. But there are some people, I bet, in this room who are afraid of flying, kind of the risk associated with flying. Now, say you want to drive to Washington, D.C., which is about 400 miles away. Now, let's think about driving or taking a plane there, assuming the cost is the same. Some people would rather drive just to avoid getting on a plane because they're afraid of the plane, so they would really rather prefer driving. Now, what is the actual risk when flying 400 miles? According to the research, the risk of dying when flying 400 miles is, let me read this correctly, 0.000012%. So that's the risk of flying 400 miles to Washington, D.C. Now, what's the risk of driving the same distance? It's 50 times more. You're 50 times more likely to die if you're driving to Washington, D.C. versus flying to Washington, D.C. So same distance. Now, why does our gut instinct steer us wrong here? What's the reason for that? Well, we're so used to seeing airplane disasters on television that our attention is drawn to the terrible images there, the images of airplane disasters, and many of us develop negative emotions around flying. So that is really problematic. By contrast, cars are ordinary and everyday objects. We use them all the time. We don't think about the accidents. We don't see accidents as kind of, and the terrible images around accidents in cars. That's not so prominent in our attention. It's the same phenomenon that basically makes us worry more about terrorism, death by terrorism, than by something much more likely and common, such as accidental poisoning or falling down the stairs. So that is attentional bias. Now, what did they learn? What did they gain when they learned about attentional bias? Well, one thing that I realized was that I can't trust my intuition about making risks. My intuition is not good at evaluating risks. And my intuition about risks reflects the emotional evaluation of risks. And as we know, System 1 is not good at evaluating probabilities. This really affected my risk association because previously I just went with my gut feeling on what the risk was. Now I had to develop a really new approach of actually evaluating the risk based on the evidence and working with the evidence and actually calculating the risk. More broadly, I realized I really need to be much more careful of where I pay attention. I started to make an attempt to manage all the information coming to me more carefully, to make sure to filter it, to make sure the channels of communication that I was getting the information from were ones that would actually lead to me getting the right information and diverse information, so diverse information sources, so that my attention would not be drawn to any one source. Now, here's an example of where in the last 5 minutes you might have miscalculated risk that led to making a mistake. You remember how I earlier told you that the risk of flying to Washington is 0.000012%? Unless you're a math genius, I don't think you process the information that quickly to actually realize the actual risk. Now, I could have told you the probability of, may I have that sheet? Something wrong with my iPad. No. All right. Like I said, unless you're a math genius, you probably did not process that information quickly. Now, when I said the risk of death when driving the same distance is 50 times more, that was immediately salient. So your System 1 was immediately drawn to that information. What if I said it another way? What if I said the risk of death when traveling to Washington by car is 0.0006%? So that's the risk of death when traveling to Washington by car. This number is indeed 50 times more than 0.00012%. Yet if I gave you 0.00006% as the risk of traveling by car, it wouldn't seem very risky at all. So in other words, my ability to tell you truthful information, yet draw your attention to one aspect of it, really gave me the ability to sway you, to influence your decisions and your thought patterns. So that is the element of attentional bias I wanted to draw your attention to. Now, there are lots of similar errors in human thinking, and you can find out about them by Googling cognitive biases on, so just the phrase cognitive biases. Won't have time to go into all of them. So, let's talk about strategies. How do we actually deal with these problems? How do we deal with the biases in our thinking? Is it better to rely on our gut or think through a situation? Research by Ludi Benjamin, Alex Heidenberg, and many others says that basically the quick answer is to think it through. When we're actually trying to make a decision, we're much more likely to make a correct decision if we think it through. Let's be honest though, thinking is hard work. It's hard work, it's effortful. Our system 1 is quick and intuitive, our system 2 is lazy. So I know mine would rather kick back and relax and watch some television rather than do the hard work necessary to think. So you should certainly not try to think through every situation. There's way too much, you'd spend way too much time thinking things. You'd really overthink things. So a quick rule of thumb. In any situation where your gut is not certain, where you're not completely certain, that's a good time to stop and thinking through. Anytime you might be suffering from a predictable error, one of these cognitive biases, which you can learn about by Googling them, stop and think it through. Anytime a decision is significant, when you're making an important decision, think it through. Don't flip a coin for where you want to do, what you want your major to be, or who you want to marry, or what kind of car you want to buy. Think it through. So let's talk about some strategies for dealing with these things. And these strategies are drawn from a wide variety of sources and adapted based on recent research to actually fit the needs of ordinary people. So these are the strategies that we'll talk about. Each strategy has an easy-to-remember title and is meant to help improve our thinking and feeling to evaluate our situation better. The broad framework that I want to talk about within strategies is gaining agency. Gaining agency. What does that refer to? There are 4 powerful elements of gaining agency. Intentionally learning about and evaluating ourselves and our environment. That's one element. Developing long-term goals and plans that meet our own needs and fit the environment. That's the second element. And that goes in turn. So first, second, third, and fourth. Then figuring out the best strategies to reach our goals and implementing these effective strategies. So figuring them out and implementing them. And finally, continuously reassessing our strategies and goals as we go through life. So continuously reassessing them. Let's talk about some specific strategies. That's the broad framework. One specific strategy is the map and the territory. It certainly doesn't feel intuitively correct for me to think through my evaluation of a situation, and it's not supposed to. Remember, our intuitions, our system 1 is going to go astray sometimes. So 20% of the time, that's a pretty high rate comparatively speaking, it's going to go astray. So intuitively, it will never feel correct to think a situation through, but that's when that's when we would benefit from going against our intuitions a little bit and going against our emotions. Now, again, the gut tells me what to do, what I feel is right, and that is not going to be the right thing to do. It's actually good thing, wise thing to do. Now, my intentional system too knows that my gut makes quite a bit of mistakes. And what helps in dealing with the emotions involved, with these emotions that I'm describing right now, is recognizing the difference between the map and the territory. All of us carry in our heads a mental map of the world, a way we think about the world. Now, that map never fully matches the reality of the territory, and the territory is the actual world. So the map and the territory. Our map of the world is never going to fully match the territory. There will always be something that is going to be not quite correct, The territory may change because of situations that we don't know about. Our information about it is always incomplete. We're influenced by our emotions when we think about it. If you come to accept that your map of the world is never fully reflective of reality, that really helps with those emotions that come up when we try to reevaluate things, when we try to rethink things. Now, the best I can do, and I think the best all of us can do, is to try to refine our map, to try to make it better, and to try to make it evaluate reality more accurately. So learning about this strategy and thinking about it made me more humble and willing to admit to myself that I may be wrong. That I may be wrong in these situations, I may be wrong here, I may be wrong there, and it's okay. Everyone is wrong sometimes, and my map is always going to be in some ways wrong and can always be improved. Doing so helps me tell my intuition, my system 1, that it may be wrong, even though it feels right. At the same time, the concept of map and territory is very optimistic. It's very optimistic because it tells me and it tells us that we can always improve our map to actually better match and better reflect the territory. That's one concept I want to share. Now, how can you tell that your map doesn't match the territory? You can notice you're confused, or you can notice that you're surprised. So our gut reaction in many ways can be helpful to us. Our intuitive emotions can be helpful to us if we learn to listen to them. And one very helpful tool for listening to them, or two related tools, is noticing that you're confused and noticing that you're surprised. Why are those helpful? Well, basically, confusion and surprise are indications that your map does not match the reality in this case. So when you're confused about something, or when you're surprised by something. So when you notice that you're confused, when you notice that you're surprised, that's the time to reevaluate and reflect on what elements of your map do not actually match the territory. Now, from my experience and the experience of others, it takes quite a while. It doesn't take a while, but it takes some effort to start to notice feelings of confusion and surprise. So it does take some effort to start to notice those feelings. But it's a very worthwhile endeavor to actually learn to evaluate reality better and more accurately. Once I started paying attention, I noticed that I was surprised and confused pretty often, and it doesn't feel great to know that my map and my reality don't match. Now, that is the best way, though, to prevent myself from making mistakes in the future. And you can actually develop more positive feelings toward confusion and surprise, toward making mistakes, through this next strategy, called bad news is good news. Bad news is good news. It's just having that thought in your head. Now, do you know why most CEOs are forced out from organizations? There are many reasons that they're forced out. Many people think it's because they fail to meet short-term profit targets. But this notion doesn't actually match the evidence. According to a study that interviewed over 1,000 board members who let their CEOs go recently, one of the top reasons for their CEOs being forced out, for them forcing out their CEOs, was that their CEOs denied reality. They denied reality. Basically, they failed to accept bad news. They failed to acknowledge bad news and deal with bad news effectively. That's certainly not a good way to be a CEO or to respond well to bad news. And one of the best ways of dealing with bad news is to accept that bad news can be good news. What does that mean? Well, if something bad already happened, it's better to know than to not know, and to know it sooner, as soon as you can, not to deny that bad news. The sooner you know, the sooner you can figure out good strategies of dealing with the bad news effectively. Adopting this mental attitude also really helps you learn from making mistakes. So you can take advantage of the bad news, you can use it to make better decisions and more effective decisions in the future, and more effective ways of evaluating reality, or evaluating the situation in the future. So when you get bad news, focusing on the positives of it, focusing on what you can take away from it and what you can learn from it is very effective. Updating beliefs is another strategy that I want to share with you. Updating beliefs. Now, if we discover that we're confused or surprised, or that we made a mistake, it's important to update our beliefs about the situation. What does that mean? Well, you might have heard the term flip-flopper used to describe politicians. It basically refers to somebody who changes their mind, and it's usually a pejorative term. It's a negative term. So, oh, that person's a flip-flopper. I think flip-flopping is great. I think all politicians should be flip-floppers. I would love it if our politicians updated their beliefs and changed their minds based on new information that they receive. I think that's the way that people should act in the world. If you get new information, you should evaluate the previous situation and actually be able and open to changing your mind based on this new information that you received, to be able to function in the world most effectively. And I would suggest that all of us would benefit from doing a little bit more flip-flopping, from updating our beliefs, from thinking more effectively about the situation. Of course, we have negative emotions around changing our beliefs, changing our patterns of doing things. There are negative emotions around that. But we'll never learn, we'll never get better if we don't overcome these negative emotions and adopt more effective ways of evaluating reality. Now, it also helps when you develop positive emotions toward updating beliefs. It basically helped me realize that by updating my beliefs, I have a more effective way of approaching the world and thinking about things and thinking about reality. While emotionally uncomfortable, at first the process gets easier and easier. In fact, people who I spoke to who adopt this philosophy, adopt this approach, report that it's hard to remember how they behaved previously before being open to updating their beliefs. Now, experimental attitude. What does that mean? A crucial way to improve your map and your territory, to update your beliefs, is to figure out experimentally, have an experimental attitude toward life. What does that mean? It's basically thinking about everything from an experimental and scientific perspective. If you notice that your map and your territory, the map might not accurately reflect the territory, take a pause, take a break, and sit down and think about what might be the actual territory. And come up with several scenarios, because you don't know. Your mental map is right now, you notice that it's not corresponding to the actual reality, to the actual territory. Now, after you do that, you think of several alternatives. You sit down and you think through what experiment you can run. What experiment you can run to figure out what the reality is. You can run a thought experiment. You can actually think through several situations and think through what the actions would be. So, if your friend got upset with you, you can start to think through, okay, why might my friend be upset with me? Let me think about the kind of things that happened. And then you can perform an actual experiment. You can, see whether that friend gets upset over this when you do this, or when you do that, if you don't want to have a conversation with your friend about that. So you can actually figure out what is the actual reality of the situation by running experiments. Specific experiments to get you specific goals. Gathering data, then refining your map of the world to better reflect the territory. Okay, one thing I want to talk about is how to remember and apply these strategies. So I get this question a lot. How do you actually remember and how do you apply these strategies? Now, one suggestion I have is to make an intentional decision to apply these strategies. That's probably the most important thing to do. To have an intentional approach toward applying these strategies. To deliberately do so. With your System 1, to have a System 2 approach to applying these strategies. To accept them as something that is wise for you, that matches your long-term goals. Then, make reminders to yourself to use these strategies. So whatever reminders you would like. I like reminders in my email that send me emails to remember to do this. Other people like reminders around their home, posters, around notes around their computer. Whatever reminder system would work well for you. We can train the subconscious System 1. So these are more about system 2 thinking. We can also train our subconscious system 1 to embrace these strategies using positive reinforcement, so something I already mentioned. Here, for positive reinforcement, you speak the language of system 1, so emotions, and you associate positive thoughts and emotions with every time you use the strategies that I mentioned successfully. All right. Let's, at this point, think about how we would apply these strategies to real life. Take 4 minutes to think about and write down your answers to the following. How might any combination of the strategies that were listed earlier have helped you deal with some of the mistakes that you thought about, that you thought about in the first part of the presentation, the early part of this presentation? That's one question. And the second question, how do you think you may use these strategies in the future to help improve the way you assess the situation? Okay, so take 4 minutes to think about those 2 questions. All right, I think it's about time. So, would anybody care to share anything about what they wrote down about applying these strategies to their past? Okay, thank you, Stephanie.
Okay, when I was a lot younger, we had a new horse come to the barn, and everybody was saying that he was crazy and you would get hurt if you rode him and just stay away from him. And of course I believed them because that's what everyone was saying, but eventually my trainer wore me down and she got me to ride him and he turned out to be the best horse I've ever had. So had I not listened to all the preconceived notions and had, just sort of dealt with it and gotten on him, then I would have known a lot sooner that, everybody else's gut intuitions about him that was, all hearsay weren't necessarily correct. It was more so the situation and his disposition.
Well, that's a wonderful example, and I think that is a great example of how these strategies can be used to help you have a more effective life. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else be willing to share?
Kind of like your story. I remember I met a friend in high school. When I first met him, I don't know, like he had a different personality, so I thought he was a little weird. But thankfully, I got to know him later because I just kept talking to him, and I realized he shared a lot of personality traits with me after I thought it through. And he was a really cool dude. So we became close friends, and if I had just just used my system one, I guess, and just completely ignored him, I wouldn't have become friends with him.
Okay, well, that's nice to know that we share a similar story. Similar experience, yeah. Would anybody else like to share? What about applying these strategies in the future? Anybody had some thoughts about that? Yes, Danny.
We use these strategies to relate to other people when I initially actually
Can you speak up a little?
I'll use these strategies to help me or relate to people that the initial reaction, my gut reaction is to a negative reaction to.
Okay. So kind of using what you learned about the fundamental attribution error, kind of how the initial gut reaction is often excessively negative toward people, and to try to counteract that, and to be more open to people. Okay, thank you. Anybody else would like to share about how they might use these strategies in the future? Yes, Heidi. Mm-hmm.
Would help you be a more happier and stress-free person because you're not so negative about, everyone's just hateful people. Why do I have to be around them? You realize that maybe they're not so bad.
Okay. Yeah, recognizing that our immediate emotional intuitions about people are not as positive as they actually should be in real life, that our system one is miscalibrated. And I think that was a good point that was brought up earlier about the orientation toward negativity and self-preservation. Good. Other thoughts?
When you're thinking about longer-term goals or bulking before a challenging situation, you talk about thinking about what you could do immediately now, take one step forward rather than kind of either refusing to engage the situation or kind of procrastinate as well.
Okay, excellent, yeah. So choosing to do the things that are effective to actually meet your long-term goals while counteracting those, while not having to deal with that long-term emotional sense of the blah for that long-term goal, but taking it one step at a time. And if you know that that's the way that it is most effective for you to be doing that. Good, yeah, it sounds like that's definitely a wise thing to take away. Anybody else like to share? All right. Well, then at this point, we'll finish up with the first part of the workshop, and we'll distribute some feedback forms. Oh, thank you. So first of all, I wanted to share about some resources on these ideas. So Center for Applied Rationality is one resource where you could find out more about these ideas for more effective ways of evaluating reality and making more effective decisions. So that's the website. There's a rationality group in Columbus that you can also check out. And here's the Facebook group. The capitalization matters on these, by the way. So if you want to check it out. Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality is a great fanfic about Harry Potter and what if he used more effective and rational ways of thinking to make his decisions. It's a blast. And then something more complex, less wrong. It's a website also kind of about, it's more longer articles, more analytical articles about strategies that you would apply.